Hi, friends. On social media this week, I was reading a post from someone who said that from a faith perspective, the closest thing they could think of to compare the situation that we're in now with quarantine and isolation was the exile, the Babylonian exile that we read about in the Old Testament, where the city of Jerusalem falls and many, if not most, of its inhabitants, especially its leaders, were taken into exile in the city of Babylon. And I started thinking about that. It's not a bad comparison, in that we have been taken completely out of our ordinary surroundings and our routines. Seems a little bit dramatic. We haven't been uprooted and forced to change nationalities. Our places of worship haven't been destroyed like the temple had been. Our religion itself hasn't been threatened. But in terms of being unsettled, in terms of being in a situation that we've never been in before, I don't think that the comparison is horrible. I was thinking about that, and as some of you know, I am kind of a history nerd. I love reading about history. On my commutes to and from the church, I am very often listening to history podcasts. It's the thing that I love to just take my mind off of current events or anything going on with work or with family. It's something that I use to take my mind off of things, and I'm just fascinated by, and kind of always have been. And so I was thinking about how that exile ended, and it's actually a really fascinating story. So, disclaimer up front, if you're not a fan of history lessons, you can take a day off from these pastoral reflections. Unashamedly, I'm going to just do a little bit of a historical storytelling session. So here goes. The Babylonian captivity lasted for several generations, but was eventually ended when the city of Babylon fell. And so it was Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great, who was the king of the Achaemenid Empire, which be the Persian Empire, as it came to be known. And it was the case that as he was coming into the city, he was aided, they think, by a bunch of people inside the city of Babylon who really didn't want to put up much of a fight. The city of Babylon, they had an army. The Babylonian Empire had an army out in the field. But what the historical records show was that the people of the city of Babylon were really, really discontented with their leader. And as the records show, that there were a large number of people inside of Babylon who were very, very willing to welcome in a new conqueror to their city, that the city of Babylon itself might not have put up too hard of a fight against Cyrus as he was coming in. And one of the groups of people who were inside the city at that time were this large contingent of Jewish refugees. And so we wonder, or we have some evidence to suggest, that there were promises being made, maybe by spies who were coming into the city or allies of Cyrus who were in the city, who made it known to the people of Jerusalem, the former exiles from Jerusalem, that if Cyrus came in and became king and conquered Babylon, that they'd get to go home. And that this might have been maybe not in the best interest of the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire at the time, but that it was really effective at undermining the continuity of the culture inside of Babylon at the time. And so it was an effective tool, we think. And sure enough, the armies of Babylon fell. Cyrus was victorious. And as we read in the books of Ezra and definitely in Isaiah, they talk about Cyrus as being the great liberator, as being God's anointed, not anointed, but being God's source of deliverance for the people of Israel. They lift him up as as a tool, as an instrument that God used to deliver God's people back into the promised land. And sure enough, he did. And actually, as they went back to the city of Jerusalem, Cyrus promised also that he would deliver funds to help them rebuild Jerusalem to its former glory, especially that as they rebuilt the temples, the city walls, like we read in Nehemiah, in the minor prophet Nehemiah, that all the money that came, most of the money that was used to rebuild a lot of the city came from Cyrus. It came from the Persian Empire. One of the interesting alternate histories that some people have proposed is wondering what would have happened if Cyrus hadn't allowed the Jewish people in Babylon to return home, if the exile wasn't ended. This happened in the 520s, 530s BC, so about 500 years before the birth of Jesus. And there are scholars who, I think with pretty good logic, would argue that the religion of Judaism might not have survived that many more generations in the city of Babylon, right? That the remnants of the Jewish faith that existed in Israel and Judah at the time most likely would have gotten swallowed up by other empires. And not to say that it couldn't have been a small little enclave of people at some point, but that it probably would have been a really minor religion if it survived at all, and that the people in Babylon might have maintained their tradition, but that if Judaism survived, that it would probably have been in a very different form or in a much smaller form than it ended up being. Certainly, what ended up taking place, of course, was that as Jerusalem was reconstituted, it regained some of its power. It was large enough and strong enough as a faith that when the Romans came a-conquering about 500 years later, that they carved out a bunch of exceptions for the Jewish people in terms of the way they practiced their religion, the way that they practiced their politics. They were forced to be reckoned with in the Roman times. And it was in that context that Jesus was born. And so there is a not inconceivable argument that if it wasn't for Cyrus the Great, the religion of Judaism, and the religion of Christianity, and the religion of Islam might not have continued into the present day, that we could right now be living in a world with completely different dominant religions in our societies, which is fascinating to think about. And I think from a faith perspective, I would probably posit that that's something that shows the ways that God acts mysteriously, right? That someone that you would not list as a great patriarch of the Jewish faith or the Christian faith truly had enormous impact, and that God's will was able to persevere or to be used in kind of those mysterious ways. I say that because as we leave, at whatever time it might be, our quarantines, our current situation, our exile, in quotes, I think it is safe to say that the lessons we take from it, the things that change because of it, the way our lives look after it, are probably not going to transpire in super predictable ways. I think that's one of the things that we as Christians, we as people of faith, are called to do, is to look at the ways that God works in the world, that works in our lives and our societies, and to really seek out where God's goodness is, no matter what happens, to look for God in the unexpected things. To put it more plainly, I think it's very easy to look for our faith to be strengthened in something like worship videos and in daily devotions, in those places that we anticipate God will show up. But that history shows us that God shows up sometimes in the most dramatic of ways in places that we would not have expected. And it's incumbent on us to look for those things, to discern where God is acting, and then as we see God acting, or as we discern God's action, that we can respond in kind, and that sometimes those discernments will lead us to a course of action, a response, an ethic of life that can be exactly what God is calling us to. So I offer this historical reflection for the purpose of not having to bore you during a sermon. I'll get it out now, so that way some sermon about Isaiah in the future won't be burdened by it. But I hope it might have been helpful. Look forward to talking with so many of you very soon. Take good care.